We often get the question, will I spend more, less, or about the same in retirement? Some folks imagine a tidy little monthly number that they'll stick to forever in a budget, like some kind of lifestyle robot. But the reality is, life is messy for all of us. There are emergencies, impulses, Costco trips, all of this where logic goes to die. Your spending will evolve whether you want it to or not, and pretending it won't is just like living in a dream world.
So Spencer, with clients, one of the biggest questions that we have, especially as we are discussing retirement with pre-retirees, folks that have maybe not experienced one or two of the good old market downturns that they'll experience multiple of in their retirement years, they come in with this anxiety oftentimes of, have I saved enough? Which is the common question. Do I have enough? Will I be okay? And how does my spending adjust throughout retirement? And so when we do financial planning, we can show and model, okay, it's inflation adjusted. The number always goes up. We can plan out different seasons of life. But the reality is that anxiety is still there. Will my savings be enough to cover my spending? The reality is spending evolves too. So today we want to talk about some different phases of retirement spending. What does it actually look like? And what are some things that we need to know? So as we think about retirement spending, what do we need to know at an outset?
Well, we think about this in really three phases. Of course, this will vary for different folks, but we think about it in the go-go years, the first 5, 10, 15 years of retirement. We think about it in a slow-go period where clients might have the same level of health, but they don't have quite the same level of energy. So they start to slow down a bit. And then the no-go years where they're really not doing nearly as much. They might still be in full health, but the level of activities and engagement and travel is just not going to be there. Now, sometimes healthcare expenses and even long-term care expenses can increase in that last of the three areas, but we'll talk about that a little bit more.
Yeah. So let's talk on that initial spending surge, the go-go years. What do we need to think about when planning for that season of life?
Well, there's a lot of folks that kind of treat their calendar like a travel agent's fever dream. They're like, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do this, all the way through in the first couple of years. And for some folks, that works really well. For most folks, even within the first year or two, they start to realize, I can't sustain this pace. There's not as much as I really want to do. So oftentimes folks will settle into a cadence where they may take a couple of trips a year, and they have a better idea of that spending. I think the thing that we often come back to is really trying to itemize to the extent that we can, what are the core expenses, and then what are those travel expenses that are likely to change, because we want to put them into a category of its own, where those expenses are going to be counted maybe for 3 years or 5 years or 10 years, whatever a client might want, but also not over the entirety of, say, a 30-year plan, because that's just not realistic.
Right. Well, and as think about this in terms of those categories of spending, there is your essential spending. You will always need food. You will always need housing. You will always need clothing. But the reality is that we will need less and less vacation over time. As we get into our mid to late 80s, we don't see as many clients that are wanting to go on European vacations as they did in their 60s and even in their 70s. So what do we need to think about? Some more of those as we move from that discretionary, that baseline spending, those essential things of food, shelter, clothing, to those more things that are discretionary. We think about the vacation spending, but housing can be one, when we think about the essential, that can be a little bit sneaky. Especially if clients have paid off their mortgage, there may be some things in the future that may sneak up on them that they're not anticipating. What are some housing things that we need to be aware of?
Well, the housing is really, where do they want to be and for the duration of time that they want to be there. If they have a 5,000 square foot home that has been great because they've been able to host their family for multiple times a year, but as they age, as they get into their 80s, maybe they don't want to do all of the yard work. Maybe they want to even have someone help them clean the home. There may be other repairs that they've always done that become much more significant. So we need to think about, what is the housing situation, and do we need to increase the level of allotted spending for that if they're going to stay in a home that's rather large, for instance, or is there a bit of income coming to them if they should downsize, in that particular situation. Now, they might be in a situation where they are they've already made that transition. There's not another transition that they're going to make, and the expenses are not all that significant there. So we want to be able to make sure that we're thinking through that sneaky component there, because it can be quite expensive. If, for instance, they've been in a home for 25 years and now we're looking at potential for a home, HVAC unit that needs to be replaced. Maybe they haven't replaced their roof in that time either, and now we're at the very end of that time frame where they need a roof replacement. All these kinds of different things, they can start to add up and get really expensive.
Right. Or if they're in our neighborhood, it's painting the house every 5 years that costs almost as much as the home, it seems like.
Oh my gosh.
So, okay, let's talk about the one that's maybe the scariest of all, healthcare, as we think about in retirement. What are healthcare spending? How does that look? Because I would assume that that's the one that we're saying, okay, that's the one that's going to keep climbing over the entire course of my life. What does that typically look like?
Well, anytime we sit down with clients, that is one of the biggest questions of how do we plan for healthcare expense as folks age. And the good news is there right now, at least with Medicare is picking up the expense for the vast majority of those healthcare expenses. So a lot of clients who we work with, they find actually that their overall healthcare cost, when we factor in Medicare costs, any supplement that they have, in addition, any out-of-pocket elements, is less than what they had during their working years. Now, for folks that are working at, say, Oak Ridge National Lab or one of these other employers that has a really good health insurance plan, the cost may go up there a little bit, but it's not skyrocketing for the vast majority of folks. So that's the good news. The thing that I think is lurking in the back of everyone's mind is long-term care.
Yeah.
And that is the biggest question mark, because about half of all people will never pay for long-term care services for them, but those who need it for 6, 8, 10 years will pay a tremendous amount for those services. So we try to do our best to kind of plan for a scenario that would be difficult, 2 or 3 years of long-term care, but not Armageddon in that. But if a client has a real concern about what if they need it for 8 or 10 or 12 years, we can certainly put that into a plan. So a lot of this is, what's your family background? What's your history? Also, what's your marital situation? Because we also find that those who are married and have a comparable age and are in good health, they tend to need long-term care a little bit less. Again, not always, but oftentimes we'll need it a little bit less, because the healthy spouse will take care of the aging spouse to the extent that he or she can typically.
Yeah. Okay. So we kind of talked about some of those baseline things, our healthcare, our housing, the vacations that we want to take. Well, let's back up a little bit and think about just lifestyle in general. How does lifestyle change throughout retirement, and how does that affect spending?
Well, it's interesting. JP Morgan puts out what they call a guide to retirement each year, and they have one of the best databases probably to look at for spending on a real level, because they have a tremendous amount of data, millions of different accounts from their Chase banking franchise, basically there. And what they show is that surprisingly, over time, those core expenditures, like you've talked about, they don't go up much, even on an inflation-adjusted basis. They don't go up much in retirement. So oftentimes, if inflation is at 2 or 3%, the level of spending won't even get that high. It might hardly budge on those core levels, because folks tend to not go out quite as much as they age and such. They're not engaged in quite as many activities. They may not be driving around quite as much. Now, there's certain core expenses, of course, taking care of your home or your vehicle, that aren't going to change too much. But what the data would suggest, at least, is that retirees, on average, are not seeing their spending go up as much as what the consumer price index, would suggest. Just because, again, they're slowing down.
Right. Well, and to your point, the consumer price index, if we look at that inflation metric, it can really be, in some ways, a fool's errand. Because if you have your home paid for, right, your housing cost, which is a tremendous piece of the consumer price index, if all you're paying is property taxes and utilities, well, maybe it's not going up as much as inflation is. There are multiple different inflation-adjusted amounts that we can look at. But the one that we use for Social Security cost of living adjustment is more of a basket that maybe doesn't actually reflect the true cost of living adjustment that a retiree needs. Now, obviously it does for some, but maybe not all. So we really need to be aware of that, okay, maybe the CPI went up 2, 3, 4%, but your real rate of inflation may be 0.5%, 1%. So we need to be aware of that not all those categories are going to affect you as much as they do others. Or like in 2020, when we saw car prices go up substantially. Well, if you don't need to buy a car, inflation doesn't affect you quite as much in that regard. So Spencer, like the consumer price index that has hundreds of different items in it, any one person's budget is going to look different than others. Their fixed costs, their variable costs. How do we think about that in terms of inflation spending, just spending throughout retirement?
Well, our experience has been that there's two ways that you could go about budgeting. One is you start with a clean slate and you start to add in different rows in your spreadsheet. And you say, okay, well, I have utility bills, I have, gasoline, I have, so on and so forth. You build it out that way. This can be helpful because you're able to put together line items. The thing that is missing here oftentimes is that it's not rooted in reality. You can remember these different pieces, but oftentimes we will get a budget where we know someone is bringing in, say, a couple $100,000 a year from their work, and they say, well, my budget in retirement is $3,000 a month. And we know that they're only saving 10% of their income to their 401k, let's just say. So we know that even though we can't say exactly where all those funds are going, somehow, after we take out, that 10%, say, going towards Social Security or going towards 401k, and some going towards tax, that there is a place that all of those other dollars are going. Yeah. And there's a lot more dollars than $3,000 a month. So what we would tend to advocate is to take a credit card statement, a bank statement, merge those together, and look at every line item and slot that somewhere. Now, there may be a trip that was a once in a lifetime trip. And so you've got 15 rows there that are just not going to be applicable. Most of the time though, there are a lot of different things that are aha moments that a client says, well, actually, yeah, that's going to be fairly typical. It wouldn't be here, but maybe it'll be over here on this side of things. I might not go back to Florida, but I'm going to go to North Carolina next year. Or, I'm not going to maybe spend that much on the home, re-roofing it, but maybe I need a bathroom remodel or something like that. So being able to take what was reality, say for the last 3 months, 6 months, 12 months, and then translate that over to a budget is a better place to start. 4 out of 5 folks, that's kind of how they think to begin with. They're not going back and looking every moment or every day at how they spent and then slotting that in. But even just looking at it broad brush, getting it over and making sure that the income that you have during your working years, minus taxes and savings towards retirement and charitable giving, let's just say, that living side of things basically matches as a starting point working years to retirement years, and then making some adjustments from there, because you might travel more, you might be driving less to work, you might have professional attire that you have to buy that you're not going to, whatever it might be, making some small adjustments there, but not a clean slate and saying, okay, it's going to be X amount of dollars, unless you really have thought through all of those categories.
Right. If you are almost the exception that says, when I retire, I'm not doing anything that I've dreamt of doing. I'm just going to live at my bare minimum expenses. Oftentimes we're wanting to encourage clients, hey, you've saved for retirement. Spend in these first seasons while you have health. And it kind of comes back to that idea of the go-go years. Okay, if we have 3 different seasons where maybe the first 10 years you're spending $10,000 a month, and in those next 10 years, the slow go years, okay, I'm going to cut out some of those bigger vacations. We'll do more local vacations. Maybe it's retreats with the family. Okay, we know that then maybe we're cutting spending down to 8,000. And then maybe that third season of no-go, okay, maybe we can only cut back to 7. But that's a much more realistic picture than saying, well, I'm going to go from spending $10,000 a month to $5,000 a month in retirement, because those are just my essential spending. We know we need to plan in there some of that accelerated level of spending.
Right.
All right. So Spencer, before we close out, what are some of the common things that retirees maybe didn't plan for that are surprising when they come up as expenses?
I think dental work is one of the big ones, and it's oftentimes not covered under the Medicare supplement or Advantage plan, that they have, and it can be expensive. We're talking tens of thousands of dollars in some circumstances. So that would certainly be one. I think long-term care overall, even though it's in the back of our minds, sometimes the intensity of it can be surprising. There's sticker shock there. In some areas, it might be $9,000 or $10,000 a month to have someone in a memory care unit. If you have at-home care, that's probably the biggest gotcha, because you're paying people to come to your home and in some cases be there with mom or dad 24/7. And in that case, it can be $150,000 or even more on an annual basis. So a huge expense there. And that doesn't have to be, the path that folks choose, but oftentimes it is, at least for a season there. The final one I would say would be families in transition. So you see a son or daughter or grandson or granddaughter go through a difficult time. Maybe they need to move across country. Maybe they're moving to a different job. Maybe they've lost their job. It can be really, really difficult. Helping out in those circumstances is great, but that also there's an expense to that. And so whether it is a son or daughter, or even a mother or father that might have declining health, that you don't realize that they just don't have the resources that they need to be able to be in a particular setting. Those are the things that can add up quite quickly. So with that though, oftentimes we can put pieces like that into the plan if we're aware of them, but sometimes those are very, very unpredictable, very, very difficult to even put into a plan at the outset.
Right. Well, I think at the end of the day, will spending increase? Will it decrease? Will it be the same throughout retirement? It's going to depend. And this is where we always say, come back to your financial advisor, your professionals that you're working with to say, hey, let's really build out a robust plan based on my specific circumstances, not Spencer's, not even what JP Morgan says in their guide to retirement. Let's look comprehensively together at what is important to you, what is important to your family's lifestyle, what's important for you in those go-go years and the slow-go and the no-go years, so that we can really create a financial plan that gives you the most confidence and rest. Clients, if you want to talk about that with us, we would love to talk about your spending in more detail. If you want to bring in the last couple months of credit card and bank statements, we would love to walk through those with you. If you have questions, leave them down in the comments below, and we'll see you again next time. Take care.
If you like these financial planning videos, please share it with a friend, and if you have questions, go to our website at SeriousRetirement.com. This content was provided by Retirement Planning Services. We are located in Knoxville, Tennessee. You can visit our website at SeriousRetirement.com. The information in this recording is intended for general educational and informational purposes only, and should not be construed as investment advisory, financial planning, legal, tax, or other professional advice based on your specific situation. Please consult with your professional advisor before taking any action based on its contents. Advisory services offered through Retirement Planning Services, LLC.